Better unmute myself. Good evening. My name is Julia Adolf, and I'm a member of the UCSC Alumni Council and one of your volunteer organizers for tonight. With me is Kelsey Knox, also a member of the Alumni Council and volunteer organizer. On behalf of the UC Santa Cruz Alumni Association, we would like to welcome you to our monthly speaker series, Slugs and Steins, Lectures from UC Santa Cruz. Before we get going this evening, I would like to provide UCSC's land acknowledgement. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. The Ama Mutsun tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. As many of you know, our Slugs and Steins series traditionally engages a UCSC faculty member in discussion with all of you, our alumni, friends, and family. We want it to feel just like you're back at UC Santa Cruz, sitting in class, but with a drink in your hand and without an exam. Before we get started, we'd like to know where you're joining us from and who you're watching with. Please take a moment to fill out a short poll that will pop up on your screen. All right, thank you to those of you who are responding. I think we should see the results now. So tonight's Slugs and Steins will be a little different than usual, as we will be tipping our Steins not with a UCSC faculty member, but with a UCSC alumni. We are pleased to welcome Professor Kevin Volkan from the class of 1981 and member of the Alumni Council. Professor Volkan is a founding faculty member and professor of psychology at California State University, Channel Islands, where he researches and teaches courses on psychopathology and atypical behaviors, clinical psychology, personality theory, as well as Nazi Germany and Eastern philosophy. Tonight, Professor Volkan will explore the idea of pathological narcissism and its connection to physical structures like bunkers and monuments. Professor Volkan will cover the destructive potential of pathological narcissism, examine bunker mentality as a defense mechanism employed by narcissistic leaders, and how monuments are used as external manifestations of feelings of grandiosity and immortality. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. If you see someone else's question that you like, you can upvote it and we will ask it sooner. All right, does everybody have their Steins? Great, we have your slug, Professor Volkan.
Okay, hello everybody. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. And I'm very happy to be here. And I know lots of great people in the audience, and I'll just thank you guys for showing up. And I'm going to get my slides going here and try to go through them relatively quickly and not do the thing I normally do, which is to go off on tangents. So I'm going to try to stick to the slides because I want to make sure we have time for lots of questions and answers at the end, and which is a lot of fun, hopefully for everybody. So let me do my share screen thing here. Gotta find that. Here it is. And it should be this one. And share. And hopefully you guys are seeing this now. Is everybody able to see the screen? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so I want to talk to you tonight about pathological narcissism, bunkers, and monuments. And this is something I've been working on and thinking about for a while. I have a paper on this, which I think there's a link at the end where I can tell you about it. And also, this is also a chapter in my new book, which is out, which I'll show you in just a second. And so here's the biography. You guys heard this already. And I will say, you know, I am a UCSC graduate. I graduated in biology of all things. But if I had a list of the professors who were really influential to me, they would not only be in biology, a lot of them would be in the humanities. And, you know, a little shout out to the UCSC humanities, which are really fantastic. And I got a lot of influence from the humanities as well as from my science education at UCSC. So I want to shout that out. And this is a picture of me here at a gallery in Santa Cruz with the artist Hildy Bernstein and sitting there in her gallery drinking tea. And I thought that'd be a good picture for you to show. So, but anyway, you can read all this junk about me here. And I definitely have done a lot of things since UCSC, but UCSC was the place that really propelled me toward doing lots of other things. And for those of you who might be my students watching or students, undergrad students, I really want to give a shout out to UCSC. If you're thinking about grad school, UCSC is an awesome place, and you should be thinking about maybe going there. So I'll just give that shout out. Okay, I'm the author of 4 books. Here's 3 of them. I will mention the first one, Dancing the Maintenance, about compulsive drug use, drug addiction. This book is available for free. You can get it on freepsychotherapiebooks.org. You can go there and download it. It's for free. These other 2 are more recent. You'll notice that my co-author is Volkan. That's my dad. And I've written these 2 books with my dad. The middle book, How the Mind Works, I didn't pick the title, by the way. The publishers picked that. It's not the Steven Pinker book. It's a different book. He has a book of the same title. This book will have a lot of the psychology background. If we go over some of the psychology stuff tonight very quickly, just know that if you want to dig deeper and understand the kind of psychology that I'm going to be talking about, a lot of that will be in this book. This book is kind of like a primer for the kind of psychology I'll be mentioning. It'll be in this book, so you can check this one out. Okay. And then the new book that I just published literally a couple days ago, just released a couple days ago, Human Aggression, War, and Genocide: The Psychological Roots of Violence. Also wrote with my dad, and there he is. He's 92 years old this year, and incredibly brilliant man. And I'm really lucky to be able to write with him and work with him. It's been a real privilege. And I think this book is a good combination of his background and my background. My dad has been a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist through his whole career, and comes from that point of view, is where I come from a point of view as a psychologist, and also somebody with a biology background, especially a background in evolutionary biology, which is something I was able to work into this book, which I was really happy about. And my dad has met with lots of world leaders and famous people, and all sorts of people who are movers and shakers in the world, and a lot of that those interactions are in the book as well. So shout out to the book. So this is my shameless plug for the night. It's out now, and I think we'll be giving you a link at the end. It's on Amazon as well, but I know some people aren't buying off Amazon, so we'll give you a link with the publisher. You can get it from them. Okay, so let's start out and talk about, why are people fascinated by narcissistic people? This is a question I get all the time, and I really like to start with a sort of a view from evolutionary psychology. And this is really, we think of ourselves really simply, we are primates. We are related to, most closely related to chimpanzees and bonobos, and a little less related to apes, but still pretty related. And we exist in a primate dominance hierarchy. And so from an evolutionary point of view, narcissistic people are people who look like they've moved up in the dominance hierarchy. And so there is we tend to be very obsessed with where we are on the dominance hierarchy. We tend to be obsessed with people who move up or people at the top. And so we pay attention to our leaders and people in sort of positions of status. They become, household words. They become people that we pay attention to. What's going on? The news is often about them. And a lot of this stuff, if you think about it, it's very primate-like. Um, what we I'm not going to talk about tonight is how we get so confused by being in not just one or two dominance hierarchies, like an early band of humans or primates, but we're really, each of us is probably like in 50 different dominance hierarchies. And that's something that creates a lot of confusion. And my take on Freudian psychology is that you can recast Freudian psychology in an evolutionary way by looking at what I call dominance hierarchy confusion. We're not going to talk about that tonight. That's a whole nother lecture I have. It's quite interesting, I think. And that's kind of work I'm doing now, trying to merge evolutionary psychology and psychoanalytic psychology, psychoanalytic theory together. And that's one of the things I'm thinking a lot about. I put a picture here of Anthony Weiner, appropriately named. He was the guy a few years ago who was a Democratic, I think a congressman, and he pictures of him tweeting his private parts got out, and he had to end up, leaving his job. And again, maybe a good example of narcissism I'm going to talk about. They made a doll of him, and the doll, you could either buy it without the anatomical detail or with anatomical detail. And the one that had the anatomical detail below the waist way outsold the one without it. So it just tells you a little bit about what human beings are really interested in when they think about, narcissistic people. There's definitely a Freudian aspect of sexuality in there somewhere. So just something to think about. I thought this was an interesting thing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about narcissism. Slides moving here. And we really can think about narcissism as a spectrum of narcissistic disorders. And a lot of people have conceptualized this in different ways, especially in the kind of psychology that I do, which is, we call this psychodynamic psychology. It stems from Freud's work, but, like physicists who studied Isaac Newton, Isaac Newton was great in the past, Freud was great in the past, but we've come a long way since those people founded the field. So, neo-Freudian psychology would include, lots of the stuff that Freud talked about, but lots of newer things too, including feminist psychology, including science, neuroscience, including more different types of psychopathology. We really have more of a full spectrum in this kind of a psychology. There's a lot of evidence-based research for using psychodynamic psychoanalytic psychology for treatment. It's quite robust. Plenty of good research showing that this is, for a psychotherapy, this works very well. So I just want to get that out of the way, because a lot of confusion about, a lot of people hear Freud is bad and anything Freudian related to Freud is bad. And I'm just here to try to dispel that rumor from everybody. But we like to think of narcissism as a spectrum. And we can think about healthy narcissism, which you can think of as sort of having good self-esteem. We can think about neurotic narcissism, which I call compensatory narcissism. Maybe sometime later on, late childhood, there's something happens, there's something, and then you have to compensate for that later on. And then we have narcissistic personality disorder and what we call malignant narcissism. And this talk, I'm not going to focus on number 1 and 2. I have a lecture, I believe it's on YouTube if you want to look it up, on narcissism on the spectrum, and you can hear about healthy narcissism and neurotic narcissism. But we're really going to talk about narcissistic personality disorder and malignant narcissism. These are the severe types of narcissism. This is what we're going to focus on tonight. And this seems to be what people are very interested in. There's a lot of talk about these kind of things in the media now. And so I want to focus a little bit on these things. So we're going to talk about the characteristics of what we call narcissistic personality disorder. There's a psychiatric manual, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, where we use to make our diagnoses for mental illnesses. And in that manual, we call this narcissistic personality disorder. Some people call it narcissistic personality. People just call it narcissism. But really what we're talking about here is narcissistic personality disorder, what we might consider to be, and we'll use the term for this talk, I'll use the term pathological narcissism. There's a lot of other names people use. My dad likes to use the name exaggerated narcissism. Other people will use, different terms, but this is really what we're talking about, the sort of level of narcissism. If we had time, we could go through the developmental descriptions of where these narcissisms come from developmentally, but we don't have a lot of time to go into detail about that, but I'll talk just briefly in a minute about that. But if you want more about that, I have other lectures on that out there, and I can refer you to those things. But here are the characteristics of narcissism: profound desire for love and admiration for people, highly inflated self-image, excessive craving for acknowledgement, emotional life that lacks depth and substance, true lack of empathy. This one is going to be really, really important for when we get to malignant narcissism. True lack of empathy, a lack of enjoyment of life besides the adoration they're getting from other people and besides their grandiose daydreams, experience feelings of restlessness and ennui, boredom, when all the external glamour and admiration it fades away. Relationships to others that are exploitive and parasitic, exertion of control and exploitation of others without guilt, coldness, ruthlessness under a facade of charm. And you'll notice these last couple ones sound a lot like what we call psychopathy, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And a lot of these have been written by a guy named Otto Kernberg, who's a psychoanalyst, who wrote a brilliant book, some books on where he talks about narcissism quite a bit. Okay, I don't know why my slides are, there we go. Okay, again, and you can take these 9 traits that we just talked about, and you're really going to look at the diagnosis. Really, you get 5 out of the 9. You can diagnose somebody with narcissistic personality disorder. And these descriptions actually come, these are kind of the same thing here, same kind of descriptions. And I want to say a little bit, move over into science a little bit and say, personality disorders, a lot of times the traits themselves can be heritable. You can be more impulsive, you can be, you can have more or less empathy, these kind of things. Those things can be somewhat heritable, but usually the combination of all the traits into the actual disorder is not usually something that we think of as heritable. It may be, and we need to do more research, but generally we don't think of the personality disorder itself as something that is typically heritable, the combination of things, but the individual traits can be. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, because somebody could have a lot of narcissistic traits. You could have 4 of them that you inherit, but you're not really diagnosable as a narcissist. So again, we want to think about that spectrum. It goes from, mild to really severe. Okay, my dad conceptualized these 9 things a little bit differently. He talks about self-concept and having fantasies of greatness. Again, sometimes narcissists present with pseudo-humility. Um, they can be over charmingly, intensely ambitious, but this kind of hides aimlessness and chronic boredom. The ethics, they can have a caricature of modesty, of ethics, and pretend to be contempt of money and fame and all those things, but that's just pretend, right? That's not actually what they really want. That's exactly what they really want. Love and sex, they can have a lot of extramarital affairs, a lot of infidelity, promiscuity, but they don't really experience their partners as separate individuals with true empathy of being separate people. They're not really able to really feel what we might consider to be love. Okay. And the cognitive style, a lot of narcissists have impressive knowledge of trivial things. They can be decisive in opinion, but they covertly forget the details, the names of other people, those kind of things. And the language that narcissists use a lot of times will clue you into somebody's got narcissistic personality disorder. Everything has to be the greatest, or whatever I do is most fantastic. You hear a lot of that kind of language coming out of narcissism. So narcissism is a really good proxy for diagnosing this kind of level of narcissism. The origins of pathological narcissism. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the psychology. Again, I refer you back to Kernberg's book, or my dad has a great textbook on this. Our book, our How the Mind Works book, will talk about this. There's a lot of really good things, but my dad and I both come out of the school of object relations. Object just is a jargon word that means another person, and usually we're talking about early life. So this is usually a significant figure in early life, a mothering person, a caregiving person, a fathering person. And really what we think that a lot of times these personality disorder level stuff comes from early childhood, where the caregiving person has been erratic, neglectful, abusive in their interactions with the child. And this can be something, typical kind of thing you see like in borderline personality disorder is the caregiving person will have a attitude like, I hate you, don't leave me. It's kind of opposite things. And this gets translated to the child, and then the child is not able to integrate the images it's taking in from the outside world, from these caregiving persons, not able to integrate them very well, and everything then ends up being all good or all bad. And then this is very prevalent. This is something you see in other personality disorders like borderline personality disorder, as well as pathological narcissism. There's an important difference in narcissism. And in narcissism, the caregiver, while having this inconsistent, neglected, or abusive sort of interaction with the infant, also instills a sense of specialness in the developing infant. So the infant is trying to take in these images from the outside world, trying to merge these into its developing system, including the brain, including the neurological stuff, the developing system, to coalesce into a sense of identity, a sense of self. But if they're just getting these inconsistent messages, that becomes almost very difficult to do. But for the narcissist, what happens is that the one consistent thing they're getting is they're being told they're special. And so what they end up doing is coalescing a sense of self around this feeling of being special, around the specialness. And this is what forms we call a grandiose self. And this grandiose self is very fragile. And underlying the grandiose self isn't constantly pumped up. Then it sort of devolves into a needy or hungry sort of self that becomes, that where the narcissist feels like if if they're not pumped up, this needy, hungry self comes to the fore, and the person can feel like they're going to stop existing. They're going to be annihilated. And so they have to constantly get pumped up. They have to constantly feel like they're pumping up themselves. And I like the image, I use this image of a tire that's flat, that you have to keep pumping it up to keep air in it, or it's going to go completely flat. Or you can think of a balloon or anything like that. A basketball that's has a slow leak in it. It has to constantly be pumped up. And this is kind of how the grandiose self operates. Okay. And it's a little simplistic. I mean, again, there's lots of more complicated versions and nuances to this theory, but this gives you the general idea. So hopefully that's okay. Everybody can kind of get that. Okay. And again, pathologically narcissistic people typically will can try to conceal the needy, hungry aspects of that self, that fragile, grandiose self, while projecting their exaggerated self-image, their exaggerated grandiosity. Okay. Um, and again, we can see this in a spectrum, from narcissists who operate this way, who can be relatively successful, to those who operate in a very malignant way. Okay. Now, I should mention, and my dad is really clear about this. My dad actually knew Jimmy Carter, and so actually interacted with him personally. I don't believe he knew Gandhi, and I don't believe he knew Nelson Mandela, but he wanted me to make sure to talk about in the book about reparative narcissism. Some narcissists are not destructive. Some people can be exaggerated or pathological narcissists who are reparative. In other words, they get their grandiosity, their sense of admiration by doing good works out there in the world. And there's plenty of people out there you can look out there among world leaders, and you can see people who probably are pretty narcissistic, but they fuel, they pump up that grandiose self by doing good works. Okay. And I don't know whether these people were or not. I mean, my dad, would talk about Jimmy Carter, so I assume he might have been one of these kind of people. But the other thing is, for my mind, I would make sure not to confuse pathological narcissism, that is doing pathological narcissist who's doing good things to pump people up, with with these other two milder ends of the narcissistic spectrum, the healthy narcissism, or what I call compensatory narcissism, which is more neurotic. It's not at the level of personality. This happens at a later developmental level. And so these are people who are far healthier, even though they exist. They show some narcissistic traits. And you'll find lots of people in leadership positions who are in number two. Okay, and so again, we have to be able to distinguish between number two and number three who do good works. And that is something I'm interested in doing more research on, and that may be some work I do in the future. But again, some of these guys may be number two, they may be number three who just do good works. That's all to be determined. We don't know. Now, malignant narcissism is a term you're hearing bandied about quite a lot lately. And this is something that people are talking about a bit. And these are individuals who exhibit destructive narcissistic behaviors. Their grandiose selves are maintained through admiration and attention that is related to directing their followers, usually their followers, to be violent toward targeted others, other groups or other types of people, or specific, can be groups or group, depending who it is. And they are aggressively projecting internal aspects of themselves that they devalue onto outside groups, and then having their followers then go attack that actual representation of their internal things they devalue internally, having their followers go out and attack that. Okay. And this kind of narcissist can also seed chaos. They make a lot of problems that then they are the only ones who can fix. And this keeps them at the center of attention and encourages the chaos to be kind of never ending. So this is something you see in these malignant narcissists. And this is something that's been talked about a lot. And I will mention there's a book, there's a couple books out there on malignant narcissism, one by Richard Wood. He has a book on malignant narcissism, very, very good work. And there's a few others out there. Another writer, Salman Akhtar, has written about malignant narcissism. There's a couple of things, people out there writing more detail about this, but this will give you the general idea. Malignant narcissists share many of the characteristics of a psychopath. So if you know anything about psychology, you know about the dark triad, people who are manipulative, they are, they only go after things for themselves. the kind of things that psychopaths do, right? They don't really have a sense of conscience. So there's a lot of overlap with the malignant narcissist. And in fact, some people characterize malignant narcissism as kind of a both, a Venn diagram where narcissism and psychopathy overlap, and the overlapping part is the malignant narcissism. That's not a bad way to think about it. I mean, the only thing is that we have to remember is that there's a difference in the motivation for the narcissist and the psychopath. And one way you can do a differential diagnosis is look at the motivation. If the motivation is that they really just want to get what they want to get, regardless of who's in the way or what they have to do to get it, that's kind of more of a psychopath. If they really, the underlying motivation is to get attention and to keep that grandiose self pumped up, that's a narcissist. And that's one way you can make the distinction. It's a little bit artificial because there's a lot of overlap between those two things. But that's a good way to think. And by psychopath, you guys know what I mean. Now, the official term for psychopath is antisocial personality disorder. There's sociopathy, there's psychopathy. In the old school, psychopathy was something, as Lady Gaga would say, you were born this way. And sociopathy is something that you acquire, through your environment. In reality, both of those terms are kind of used very loosely, interchangeably. So you can take your choice. If you want to be really, exact about it, call it antisocial personality disorder. But psychopathy, sociopathy are out there. And the reality of it is probably, whatever you want to call it, it's probably nature and nurture together. It's probably some of both, right? Some of both are in there. I like to use the term psychopathy because I'm old school, and that's what I always used to talk about it. So, you'll probably hear me say that more than any other thing. Just realize the other names are fine too. Okay, now I want to talk about bunker mentality. So, pathological narcissists, especially these malignant narcissists, will frequently literalize their strong desire to protect this self that they have to keep pumped up. And we know this because when we see the unconscious coming out from these people, especially through dreams, that a lot of times these pathological narcissists will have dreams about bunkers, tunnels, walls, barricades, bubbles, things that they get in or behind that protect them, right? And this is symbolic protecting this grandiose self, which appears inflated and grandiose, but is actually very fragile. Okay? And so we call this bunker mentality. And I'll give a shout out to my colleague, Professor Rainer Bushman, who's a history professor, who has talked about bunker mentality. I teach a class on Nazi Germany with him, and we talk about bunker mentality in relationship to the Nazis, because the Nazis built lots of bunkers, and hopefully I'll have time in a little bit to show you some examples of the Nazi bunkers. But we take bunker mentality and think about it from a psychological point of view. We're really talking about these sort of fantasies, these narcissistic fantasies about these protected bubbles and bunkers, these kind of things. And you could even think, in terms of these things maybe being like an iron dome. It doesn't have to be a physical bunker. It can be a symbolic or even a system that functions as a bubble, a protective bubble. Franz Kafka, who you guys I'm sure know, wrote a story called Der Bau, the Burrow, an unfinished story that was not published in his lifetime, where he talks about bunker mentality. He actually wrote about this mole who goes and lives in the bunker. And this quote, I love this quote, but the most beautiful thing about my burrow is the stillness. Of course, that is deceptive. At any moment, it may be shattered and then all will be over. For the time being, however, the silence is still with me. And I just think this really conveys the feeling and the sense of this bunker mentality, the isolation of it, the stillness of it, that the narcissist is in, themselves, and all the world is just outside of the bunker. They don't relate to it. They don't empathize with it. They just stay protective in this bubble. And I really thought this is a fantastic story that really gets at this idea. And so my dad has a wonderful case history where he had and I'll just talk about this really quickly. He had a woman he was seeing, a narcissistic woman he was seeing, who had dreams of being in a bubble, and she presented all these bubble dreams. And over the period of her psychoanalysis, the bubbles became more and more permeable. till the end of her analysis, she came out of the bubble, right? The bubble became completely permanent. And so these bubble dreams, even in psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, you can see the bubble dreams will give you a sense if the person is actually, the narcissistic person is getting better. Now, this person my dad saw was not a malignant narcissist, so she wasn't on the real severe end of the spectrum, but definitely was a pathological narcissist. And so again, this gives you a sense of the narcissist's internal world. Okay, for malignant narcissists who have more stronger aggressive impulses, their defense mechanisms, their bubbles may be stronger, and they may manifest in more kind of militaristic types of protective things. And these may not, dispel as easily, and they don't dispel easily in therapy. They don't dispel as readily, even in intensive therapy, as somebody who's not a malignant narcissist. Right? And it can also manifest in the literal physical construction of bunkers and walls. And especially when the external world doesn't cooperate with what the narcissist needs, they become anxious, and retreating to this wall, this symbolic bunker place is something that that is defensive for them. They're defending their grandiose self in a literal way by going into a real, actual, literal created bunker. Okay, and they're sort of this quest for this defensive isolation. And this is one of the things you see, these numerous narcissistic leaders who build bunkers or hide behind walls or have these protective kinds of things. They're very, very common. And once you start thinking about it, you see it all over the place. And I'll give you a couple examples of this. This was Muammar Gaddafi's Bab al-Azizia Splendid Gate compound. And so sometimes the bunkers are very beautiful like this, but this was reinforced concrete walls guarded by machine gun posts every 50 meters. I think Gaddafi's probably a pretty good example of a narcissistic leader. And this is an interesting place. I mean, it was a really beautiful place, and, somewhat could kind of, in a way, remind you maybe of other places. This is what it looked like after it was bombed. So this is what ends up happening. This is the collapse of the narcissistic bubble, and kind of reminiscent of maybe some other kind of really beautiful compounds that you might see among certain leaders. And I'll leave it to you to figure out where this one is. Right. Less grand is Saddam Hussein's infamous Spidey hole that he hid in. This is also bunker mentality at a much, kind of more compact, less grand example. And we can also think of whole nations being bunker nations. And North Korea is a really good example of this. North Korea is like a bunker nation. The whole country is like a bunker. And Kim Jong-un not only has a massive personal bunker, but that's concealed under a mountain, but he also has all these bunkers and tunnels riddled throughout the whole country. And this caused the U.S. and South Korea to actually develop a certain kind of a bomb, a missile or bomb that will go down and penetrate and blow up the bunkers underneath. So this becomes part of this weapons race, right? They build these bunkers, and then the other side has to build something that will get into the bunker. And again, if you want to think about this psychologically, this is a perfect example of kind of these narcissistic interactions between nations. And this is some example of the Kim Jong-un stuff. Bunker things here. All right. Okay, another one that came up recently, and I've been thinking about this a lot, is this NEOM project by Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, also called the Line. This is a massive structure that's built across almost 170 kilometers across the desert. And this is a massive undertaking, and it's actually being built now. And this is a picture of it being built. Whether it's actually going to be finished or not is really, really, we don't really know. I mean, the amount of money, even for the Saudis, to spend on this is just it's staggering. And Saudi police have been supposedly told to kill any villagers who get in the way, who resist being evicted, to build this thing through their land. And an ex-Saudi intelligence officer, supposedly, according to the BBC, revealed that authorities were permitted to use lethal forces on those who were in the way of this thing. So I mean, this is an amazing, and if you look at the inside of it, I think it has a lot of the characteristics of bunker mentality. It's a huge project, I mean, maybe dwarfing all other bunkers historically. Things are really unbelievable. All right. So what I want to talk for a minute and get through the slideshow is I want to talk specifically about Adolf Hitler and Enver Hoxha. These are two leaders that to me really epitomize, pathological, really malignant narcissism, at least in Hitler's case, malignant narcissism and the bunker mentality. And I hope you like my AI pictures of these guys and my AI picture of Bunker here. Didn't quite capture them perfectly, but I think you get the idea. Hitler is a good example of malignant narcissist. I probably doesn't really, you don't really have to say much to convince people of that. But he's an example, or he encouraged his supporters to show him admiration through the destruction of those who symbolized things that he would project out onto other groups, and especially Jewish individuals, right? So he projected his negativity out on these Jewish individuals, and then his followers were then to go out and destroy those people. Okay, and this, of course, is the where we get the Holocaust from, the horrible, horrible stuff. Hitler was he was bunker crazy. He built lots and lots of bunkers. Nazi Germany was very famous for bunkers. Nazi Germany was also very famous for monuments, but not in the sense of like Hitler having statues built about him, but instead of making these grand architectural statements. He worked with Albert Speer, who was one of his ministers, who was an architect, and came up with these elaborate plans to build these giant, kind of monument city structure kinds of things, and was doing that until the war went badly, and at which point, when the war started going worse, really began concentrating on building bunkers. Okay, and I have a quote here, actually interesting, left from Mao Zedong, talking about like, once the Third Reich is, once they're on the defensive, they're done, right? And I think, that when the Third Reich starts to focus on building bunkers, over building, massive, public structures, they're done. I mean, that the end is coming. And so one of the things the Nazi government had something called the Führer principle, which is basically, whatever the Führer says is law. So, as you know, in Nazi Germany, the parliamentary procedures, the powers between the branches of government disappeared when Hitler takes over and becomes the Führer. What Hitler says is the law, not to be questioned. And what Hitler says is build bunkers. And so the Nazis built bunkers. And you can see here, this is the line here of the bunkers that was built, stretching from Norway through Denmark all the way down through France. This is the Atlantic Wall. And one quote of this is that the immensity of the project defies common sense. Total war was revealed here in its mythic dimensions. And again, initially this is built to defend the coastline, right? But I mean, it's done in a way that is really over the top, right? I mean, this is the unbelievable amount of bunkers and effort that went into this kind of thing. And you can still find these. You can still go and see the remnants of these. There's lots of them left. And here's some more of this. There's 12,000 Atlantic Wall bunkers built. And typically what they did, my understanding, and I may be wrong about this, my understanding was that there was a level down, the first level where these kind of things would have the guns sticking out. And then above them in some places would be a bigger bunker kind of a structure. And so you had kind of these multiple structures going on. And these aren't the only bunkers the Nazis built. They also, there's bunkers in the cities that you can find. And there's even some that have been left over that the German government's been trying to sell these off and get people to do stuff with them. They're hard to remodel because they're full of concrete, their walls are thick of concrete. They're very difficult to remodel, so they're hard to sell to people. Some of the bunkers were interesting enough were built on the side of synagogues. They would bulldoze down a synagogue and build a bunker on top of it. This is an example of one. This one in Friedberger Anlage here. This is an example of a bunker that was built on top of a synagogue. The city of Hamburg itself had more than 600 bunkers. These were, used a lot in the war. A lot of these were used as air raid shelters because the Nazis were being bombed day and night. So initially, they were using these things as military, places to put guns, military things, and then also for air raid shelters. But by the end of the war, these are places to retreat to. And also they started relocating war production into these bunker-like structures, huge structures. And you can see some of these like this one here. And they would store V2 rockets and liquid oxygen. The wonder weapons became, they became obsessed with wonder weapons, and so the bunkers started being used for wonder weapons and to, for the Nazi high command to retreat to, rather than air raid shelters for the common people, nearer the end of the war. And these are massive things here. These would hold lots of things, just the 16-foot wall, 23-foot walls, I mean, these massive concrete things. One of the most interesting one was attempted to be completed by Spear and was not, was called Project Giant. This was a large, gigantic underground bunker. They never quite figured out what this was going to be for, whether this, at the end of the war, whether this was going to be the ultimate shelter for Hitler and the other higher ranking Nazis. There's all sorts of speculation that, they were building time machines and UFOs and, here, and you can find all sorts of really interesting conspiracy theories around this. They have their own psychology, which is interesting, but this is the inside of it. It was absolutely massive. People have made comic books about it. There's all sorts of thoughts about aliens and UFO bases and time machines. This was also the time machine here. So far we haven't had Hitler come back, go into the future in the time yet. So probably it was not a time machine. The Führer bunker, this is the most famous bunker that everybody knows about. This is where Hitler spent his last days of his life. And if you read anything by the author Trevor Roper, he has documented a lot of the last days, as also has Joachim Fest. Fest is the guy who wrote a book detailing what it was like in the bunker in the last days. And you can see a very good account of this in the movie Downfall, Der Untergang, which is a really, really hard movie to watch, but it's very, very well done. And the guy who plays Hitler, and I'm blanking on his name right now, he does a fantastic job of playing Hitler. And, you'll see all the parodies where they have him ranting and raving, and they put all sorts of things like the freeway being closed down or whatever. But the movie itself is very, very heavy. And, theoretically, we think it's pretty accurate. And you can really get a glimpse into the experience of a malignant narcissist who's undergoing a full-on psychological collapse. Okay, and this is the last picture of Hitler that was taken outside the bunker before he commits suicide, and this is the poster for the movie. We used to show the movie in our class, and Professor Bushman and I, after seeing the movie, I don't know, 50 times, we finally said we can't watch it anymore. It's just too heavy. So we just tell the students to go watch it. But it's very good. I highly recommend it. Let's talk a little bit about Enver Hoxha. Enver Hoxha was the dictator of Albania from 1944 until 1985. He built over 750,000 concrete bunkers across Albania because he was paranoid that the Soviets were going to have a nuclear attack on his country. Even though he was ostensibly a communist, ostensibly allied with the Soviets, he was very paranoid about them. They're fortified. They're in the shape of these round pillboxes. I'll show you these just a second. They're in all these different sizes all over the landscape of Albania. They dot the landscape of Albania. They are again built in such a way with reinforced concrete that's very, very thick. They're very hard to dismantle. And so people don't bother dismantling them. They're still there. You can go there and see them. And I'll show you a picture. There's one of them. And Hoxha was paranoid about a nuclear attack or foreign invasion, and so he had all these things built all over the place. My dad actually went to Albania and visited these. He actually got to go and see them, and he wrote, "Seeing them for the first time was eerie, especially as none of the mini books, papers, and reports in Albania had mentioned the bunkers." Hoxha and his people were told he had learned to build terraced hillsides from the Chinese, and these were everywhere, and these are very soothing, beautiful, like, pastoral landscapes where they would grow food. But then they would put these bunkers on top of them, and my dad felt these were really, really at odds with the beautiful sort of landscape. And they didn't have the funds to destroy these at the end. And perversely, the bunkers then became a symbol of Albanians' large group identity. And if you read the book, my new book, we talk a lot about what large group identity is. And these things we're talking about, narcissists, and we're talking about bunker mentality, also can function at a lot of these things that we're talking about psychologically, can function at a collective level. And that's a whole interesting thing. And a lot of the book is based on talking about that collective level of stuff. Okay. And so, even these bunkers become part of the identity of being an Albanian, and they sell them in the souvenir shops and everything. And they're still there because they're hard to get rid of. And they do things, and people turn them in, like this place got turned into a hamburger joint, right? And another one, here's another picture of some of them dotting the landscape. You can see them here, everywhere. And then some of them, they've turned some of them, like this one got turned into a memorial museum. And so you can see these kind of things there. So this is another great example of bunker mentality. You can still go visit these. Okay. Um, Let me talk a little bit. I'm going to end by talking about the psychology of monuments. And monuments are, in a way, I'll give the punchline away. Monuments are kind of, in a way, the opposite of bunkers. But monuments have a couple purposes. And the first purpose of besides narcissism, they can be a projection of a narcissistic leader's grandiose sense of themselves. But they also can be something that serve to connect individuals in a society collectively to grieving, either grieving lost comrades, lost family members, lost people from the society, or a loss of the kind of a collective loss. The nation might lose territory or status or something like that. So the monuments can connect to those kind of things. And that, in a way, you can think of that latter way of the monuments functions as maybe a little more healthy, right? That you have a monument, and it helps people connect to grieving over something that we've lost as a society, or that as part of the society we've lost personally. Okay. And here's a good example of this. This is a statue called one of the Mound of Glory statues. There's a number of these in the ex-Soviet Union. This one, ironically, is in Ukraine, it's in the city of Nova Odessa, which I believe is a very lot of Russian-speaking people in this city. So as far as I know, I was able to tell this is still there. It has not been taken down by the Ukrainians. It's still there. But this pays homage to the Soviet soldiers killed during World War II. And that's a whole nother talk we could have about, the psychology of the Russians in World War II. That's a whole nother lecture. But when we do talk in the book about Putin, we will talk a little bit about that, the sort of psychology of Russia and how they view World War II and that kind of thing. But this is a huge statue. You can see the size of the people here. This thing is huge. And I think maybe I have another picture of it from a distance. So you can see it up on the mound here. These are these mound of glories. They put them up in these mounds here. Okay. Other monuments that serve this grieving purpose, obviously the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. This is a great example of this. This is a place where we go and we can grieve for the people that were lost in this war. This other example is the Sintaf in Hiroshima. This is another example of grieving for something that was lost, for people who were killed. That we can do collectively. We go as a symbol collectively of our grief that helps us process our grief. Hopefully, helps us process our grief. And these help us remember these collective traumas. Okay. And they can also function as something that we call, and my dad's written a lot about this, about linking objects, right? And linking objects acts a connection between the mental image of a lost individual or an item at the individual level, but it could be something more collective at the group level, the large group level. And it's something, the image that is in the mind of the people who are doing the grieving. And so in individuals, we can think people who are perennial mourners, people who their mourning is undigested. Maybe they're having trouble getting through it, and they have these objects to link them to the person. They can't let go of the person mentally, so they have objects that link them to them. And some examples might be, you guys may not remember this, some of you who are younger, but back in the day, we had machines that collected your phone messages, right, with little tapes in them that would collect the phone messages. So you might have had a message from your lost parent that was on the machine. You would have saved that, and that would have become a linking object. Other thing I've become really interested in, and I'm going to be writing about this, are tattoos. People get memorial tattoos, and these also link you to the person who is lost, right? This maybe then will help you get through the grief, hopefully. But we think about this at a collective level. Monuments can serve the same function. They can help people through the grief. And this is an example of a COVID memorial in Italy, that functions, I think, probably as a linking object for people trying to grieve. Okay. And there's other examples of this as well. This is an interesting one. This is called the Crying Father, which is a monument in South Ossetian, but used by South Ossetians to externalize not only the mourning process, but also can fuel feelings of revenge, can keep those ideas and that we got to get back at these people, right? So the monument can also have a little bit of an aggressive tinge to it, right? And my dad calls these kind of monuments hot. Cool ones are just for taking contemplation, getting a wider perspective of things. We think about the Vietnam Wall is more like that. This kind of hot linking object, mourning statue, is more about like, also has some sense of revenge in it. Okay. So let's move and talk about monuments as narcissistic structures, and I'll finish with this. Um, so a writer named Just Merilou talked about monuments being used to express feelings of aggression, Oedipal guilt, belief in eternal importance. And this is kind of the seed of where we get the narcissistic aspects of monuments. For pathological narcissists, monuments have similarities with bunker mentality, but the monuments can be viewed as the opposite of bunkers. Bunkers are defensive in nature. Monuments exude a sense of aggression. Okay. Bunkers are for retreating. Monuments are, in a way, if you want to think about it from a real Freudian point of view, are phallic and penetrative. Okay. But they take different forms. A lot of the monuments in Nazi Germany, as I mentioned, were like, these grand buildings and everything. And these are done a lot of times when the narcissistic leader's power is expanding, they'll build these kind of monuments. But when the power is retreating, as I said, then they'll start building bunkers. Okay. And this is an example of the statue of Sapar Murat Niyazov, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who was the Turkmenbashi of Turkmenistan. He was the late leader of Turkmenistan, and was known for building very grandiose statues of himself in the country, and I think probably fit the bill as a pathological narcissist. The narcissist receives adulation vivo in the bunker, staying alive in the bunker, but the monument stands in place of the narcissism and it receives adulation in situ for eternity. So the monument is something where the narcissist, has their immortality. Okay. And these are very interesting. And there's lots of these, right? There's lots of different. A lot of times the monuments, the narcissistic monuments, will have an image of the narcissist. And, I could mention a recent US president who proposed being added to Mount Rushmore, but there's other ones, that you can find. Hitler, interestingly enough, was not fond of having his image out there. He did allow small little statues or busts of him to be made, but he did not put his face on giant statues on the side of buildings. He wanted the buildings themselves, these kind of massive, colossal buildings, to speak for his narcissism. So he was a little bit the little bit not in the norm of these narcissists with regard to showing their image, but a lot of narcissists like to show their image. Okay, this is a statue of, believe it or not, Saint Vladimir in Russia, and you can guess who might have, caused this statue to be built. Another Vladimir, right? And so this is the patron saint of Vladimir's, and it represents the Vladimir that we all are hearing about recently, Vladimir Putin. And so this is you could think of this as, in a way, kind of a narcissistic monument. Okay. Both bunkers and monuments act as a defense against the narcissist's deep fear of being wiped out, but just in different ways. Okay. And here's a kind of, because I like maps and diagrams, here's a way you can think about it. Kind of, you think about here: bunkers provide protection, bunkers allow isolation, monuments project grandiosity, monuments symbolize immortality. So this is what you can kind of see. And if I knew how to do graphics better, I would have had these things pointing the opposite direction, and these ones pointing this direction. They go the opposite, but they're along a kind of a spectrum, if that makes sense. Okay. And again, what I want to kind of end with is the idea that the emphasis on building bunkers, walls, and monuments may be a warning sign that a leader is exhibiting exaggerated or pathological or malignant narcissism. And again, if you want to know malignant narcissism, you probably want to see how aggressive, how militaristic the monuments and the bunkers are. I would say probably the more militaristic they are, the more they embody some kind of aggression, probably the more likely that leader is to be more malignant of the narcissist. Okay, but you see this in any kind of pathological narcissist. And so this may be a warning sign. This is something to look out for in your leaders, if they are prone to building monuments and bunkers, especially bunkers first, maybe as they're becoming in power, and then as their power recedes, building, you see them retreat to bunker-like structures. They may already have it built, but they retreat to it and spend a lot of time there. That also can tell you that maybe that's a pathological narcissist. Okay. And so this could be also a defining feature of totalitarian or totalitarian leaning or totalitarian, becoming governments. And for totalitarian becoming governments, I'll refer everybody to the books by Timothy Snyder, the historian Timothy Snyder, who's a professor at Yale University, who I've had the really great fortune to meet and have a nice chat with him about some of this stuff. And his books are fantastic. On Tyranny is a small book worth reading. And he'll talk about how governments become totalitarian in a lot of detail. And he's studied this stuff quite a lot, so he's got a lot of knowledge about this stuff. But I'm thinking probably many, if not all, totalitarian leaders exhibit some level of pathological narcissism. Um, and people with pathological narcissism don't simply rise to leadership positions overnight. The progression takes time. Okay. And again, while that's taking time, you may start seeing some of this bunker mentality, and that ought to be a little bit of a red flag. Okay. A potential leader's ideas for bunkers, bunker-like edifices, extravagant monuments, along with disparagement and belittlement of specific groups should be viewed as early warning signs. And again, you can read some of that stuff in the book. We'll talk more in detail about that. Okay. All right. I think I'm done now. And so here's some references, and here's some stuff here. I'm mentioning a couple other books here by some colleagues. Dr. Messina, who's written a number of books on Trump and on how you deal with narcissists, and Dr. Wood, who's written about Putin and also has written about malignant narcissism. So I'm going to shout out to them. And I think I'm done. I'm ready for questions. So yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I think we all learned some interesting things from you today. Our first question, I think we could have guessed that this was coming. This person is interested in hearing your thoughts about where along the spectrum of narcissism Trump falls.
Well, I'm trying to be not political, and I have a couple reasons for this. One is that this has been written about. There are two books by mental health professionals on Trump. One is written by a bunch of Jungian analysts, and the other one's written by a wide variety of different theoretical orientations about Trump. And not surprisingly enough, if you boiled all those diagnoses down, people pretty much think Trump pretty much seems to fit in the narcissistic spectrum, and maybe more in the pathological end. I will tell you that in my classes for the last 20 years, before Trump went into politics, I've been using him as an example of a narcissist. So, again, and I'm not picking on his politics or whatever you want to believe. You like to vote for him. Certainly, we have lots of pathological narcissists in politics on both sides of the aisle. I could found somebody else and pick them. Trump is in the news now. We're a little overloaded with Trumpism, maybe. So I'm kind of taking Trump out of the talks I'm giving. But I will say I have a paper. If you want to read it, you can look it up. It's online for free in the European Journal of Psychoanalysis on the same topic, bunker mentality. In fact, this lecture is derived from that paper to some degree. And that paper, rather than talking about Enver, Hoxha, I talk about Trump. So you can go read all the stuff I've said about Trump in that thing. But I'm trying to talk about the bunker mentality because that's the new thing. Lots of other people have talked about Trump's narcissism. And again, I refer you to Dr. Messina's book, her books, and then the two books which I don't have the titles to, but if you just go and search them, one is like 27 or 37 psychiatrists talk about Trump. You just search for it on online and you'll find it. So that's what I would say. That answer the question, hopefully.
I think so. Thank you.
And also, I'll say you guys can draw your own conclusions about what I've said today. Take the stuff, the principles I've talked about tonight, as far as pathological narcissism, bunker mentality, and you can fit the puzzle pieces together and make your own judgment about whatever leader that you're interested in knowing about. These are fairly common among lots of pathological narcissists. And so, you can do your own diagnoses. You don't need me to tell you, you can figure it out.
Okay, Kevin, we've got another question for you from
Sure.
Kristen, who asks, are narcissists particularly vulnerable to manipulation? And then posted an article from 2021 from The Guardian.
Yeah, I would say yes, with some caveats. So what you find is, and there's some really interesting um, works on this, and I'm blanking on the ones. It'll come to me in a minute. The woman's name who wrote the book. But what you find is that if you have been around narcissists, especially if you've grown up with narcissists, you learn how to manipulate them. So if you grow up with narcissistic parents, you know how to you learn how to manipulate them. So they are very manipulatable if you understand, not necessarily from an intellectual level, but you understand from a feeling level what they want, and you're able to feed them what they want, and then you're able to get what you might need out of it. And again, I can refer you to politics. You can see this is how a lot of politics works, with narcissistic leaders, that people are getting what they want. And, you can ask yourself again, the level of psychopathy or the psychopathic traits of the people who are getting the things from the narcissistic leader. But once you figure out what motivates them, which is usually attention, grandiosity, keeping that grandiose self pumped up. Once you figure out that is what they need, then they're very manipulable. But not everybody can figure that out. Not everybody's psychology allows that. And if you've had narcissistic parents or narcissistic people you've had to deal with, and you've learned to do it successfully in your early life, then it becomes very doable. Yeah.
Thank you.
Our next
And
question.
rid of the slides, right? Is that okay? The slides went off. Is that all right?
That's fine.
Okay, good.
Thanks. Our next question is from Pat, who asks, can pathological narcissists be cured, or is it impossible to expect that they will ever become compassionate?
So I would say is that you have to look at the spectrum of things. So again, think of things on the spectrum, and there's always exceptions to the rule. Okay, for one thing, there are genetic aspects, there are neurodevelopmental aspects, there are a lot of things that play into the, where the origins of a specific person's narcissism are, besides just the psychological stuff. I will say the psychological stuff is very, very important. If somebody is in the milder end of the spectrum, medium end of the spectrum, I think, psychotherapy is very good. Now, psychotherapy could either help them, adapt their personality to being in the world, learning how to adapt. They're narcissistic, they have a narcissistic personality structure, but they've learned to adapt it so they get along and be in the world. Or, maybe something like a full psychoanalysis, they can go and they can restructure their personality. And in my dad's cases, that the one that we talked about in the slideshow, that's a situation where this woman had full 5-day a week psychoanalysis for a number of years and was able to really be cured of it. So it is possible to be cured of it. When you get to the more severe end of the spectrum, then you can have more of a question mark. It's going to really depend. And there are some psychiatrists, psychotherapists, psychoanalysts who specialize in narcissism. One of the most famous ones is Heinz Kohut, who's written a lot about narcissism. His stuff's not my cup of tea, but a lot of people really like him. And then Otto Kernberg would be the other one. And Kernberg has developed some specific psychotherapies for dealing with personality disorders that, at least for other similar, cognate personality disorders, seem to be helpful and may be able to shorten the time. So I do think it's possible if somebody's really malignant narcissist, if they really have a lot of the psychopathic characteristics, if they're more of a psychopath or they are a psychopath, then I would say the prognosis is a lot worse. They're probably not, therapy is not going to be very helpful. Usually. And again, there may be exceptions to that, but usually not. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, we've got another interesting one. Harley asks, where would religious monuments and cathedrals fall in the spectrum? They seem to exhibit a number of the characteristics that you cite here in your talk.
That's a very good question, and Harley is a very, very brilliant person. So I will say and I should have mentioned this actually during the thing. So I gave you these kind of categories of these monuments as these separate things, right? But in the reality is they overlap each other, right? So thing could be a linking object. It could be something that also is used for revenge. It could also be something that's used for grieving. It also could be something that's a projection of power. And so a religious monument could be any of the above and a combination of the above. I'm not an expert on Christianity, so I couldn't tell you about Christianity, but if you want to think about it probably in the nicest way, you'd think a religious monument is something that helps people deal with the loss of something, or it could be the loss, like it could be a fall from grace, it could be a wanting to move to a more higher plane of existence. We're stuck in samsara, we want to move to enlightenment. We've been kicked out of the Garden of Eden, we want to get to heaven. Those kind of things could also have a mourning aspect to them. But you could also think of religious monuments that are also like, we're a monument, our religion is the one, and we're going to get the other ones. We're going to get the other people out there. And it could be a combination of those things. So hopefully, Harley, that answers your question. But I think you could have combinations of these things. And I think each kind of monument and each religion may have a different flavor to it. And you also then have to also factor in the cultural aspects. What's the culture of the religion? What culture is it? Because the cultural aspects also play a role. And in the book, we talk a lot about chosen traumas and chosen glories. That's some categories of kind of a collective way that people, look at themselves, and that also can play into the flavor of the monuments that they're built in the culture.
All right, thank you. Our next question comes from Jenny Rose. How does bunker mentality affect a leader's decision making and governance, especially in times of crisis?
Yeah, I would say the bunker mentality is the result of the narcissistic mentality. So the narcissist has to keep that grandiose self pumped up all the time. And so their decision making is going to be influenced by that. And again, if they're more malignant, they're going to pump it up through more aggressive types of things, more chaotic types of things. If they're more, a reparative leader, they're gonna keep it pumped up by doing things that people admire them for. When that stuff isn't working well, and while they're doing that, and while they're in that phase of it, while they're pumping up, they're doing things either malignantly, aggressively, or might say lovingly or constructively. That phase, they're building the monuments, they're projecting out, right? If that's not working very well, then you see the retreat back into the bunkers. Okay, we got to go back to the bunker, got to go back and retreat, like suddenly the leader is gone. They went back to their compound somewhere. You don't hear anything about them for a few days. And then, they've kind of retreated. And then they might come out, here's a new idea. They're out again. They're trying to push out. They're trying to pump up the self up. And so you're kind of seeing this, think of it as like a giant leaky, basketball. You kind of see it, expand out, monuments. You kind of see it collapse, bunkers, expand out, collapse, expand. It kind of goes in this sort of cycle of expanding out, collapsing, expanding out, collapsing. And that can be over a shorter period of time or a longer period of time, depending on the person, where they are in their political career, what kind of political system they're in, that kind of thing. The more longer term totalitarian systems, the bunker can expand, and keep expanding for a lot longer because there's not much resistance to it, right? But then when you see it sort of collapse in, that's more of the bunker kind of thing. And that expansion and collapse, and that thing has been known for a long time. I mean, the Chinese talked about this. Ancient Chinese talked about the mandate of heaven, that the ruler had a duty to the people and the people had a duty to the ruler. The people would support the ruler while they're expanding and they're doing something for the people. But if not, things started collapsing and the ruler was, done for, right? So the ancient Chinese talked about this same sort of pattern. So that's how I would say it. Hopefully that makes sense.
That actually is a good segue into the next question, which are why are people attracted to pathological narcissists?
Yeah, I have a theory about this. I don't know if it's correct or not, but I do think that it's something evolutionarily, that it relates to our being in dominance hierarchies. And that, primate dominance hierarchies, there's usually these alpha animals. A lot of there are alpha males and females, but you think about, especially something like chimpanzees are more male dominated, and you think about like people are trying to find their way in the dominance hierarchy, the leader, the narcissistic leader who's at the top is sort of one of the anchors of the hierarchy. So that's the person that we're either going to try to measure ourselves against. It tells us where we are in the hierarchy, or that's where we're going to try to ascend to get more status in the hierarchy. And I think some of that is wired in. I don't I do think that human beings, obviously, because we have a much more huger imaginal capacity than primates, we've made things way more complicated. And then that we have fantasies, we have language, we have imagery that we bring into all this. But if you boil it all down, I think probably a lot of it has to do with being in a dominance hierarchy and knowing where you are in the dominance hierarchy, because that's a survival thing, right? Knowing where you are in the dominance hierarchy is a survival thing. You don't know where you are, you challenge the alpha animal, you may die or you may be excised from the group, and then you're not as likely, you wouldn't have been as likely to pass on your genes as those who knew where their place was in the dominance hierarchy, or who knew how to ascend the dominance hierarchy. There's a survival aspect to that. There's also a survival aspect to staying part of the group, right? And this is why we have a tendency to go along with whatever the leaders tell us to do. We have a tendency to conform. Human beings have a strong tendency to conformity. And there was a survival value in that. If you didn't conform, you were out of the group and you were going to get eaten by a lion or something. So that's how I would look at it. And that's, I mean, I may be oversimplifying it, but that's how I kind of think about it a little bit.
Thanks.
And I will say, shout out to UCSC. I'm very influenced in this kind of thinking by, the former UCSC professor, Robert Trivers, who wrote, a book on sociobiology. You can also look at kinship and these kind of things. It gets a little more complicated, but I'm giving you the very simplistic version of it.
Perfect. Thank you. Our next question is if you can provide an example to illustrate the distinction in motivations between malignant narcissism and psychopathy.
Yeah, that would be hard. I mean, again, we're splitting hairs a little bit here, right? So, a psychopath is somebody who just wants to get what they want. And there's different kinds of psychopaths as well. So that's another thing. It's a whole nother lecture. We could talk about the different kinds of psychopaths. There are impulsive psychopaths who you can do a brain scan and you can see that, the frontal cortex isn't really lighting up too much. And then there are psychopaths who are more strategic, and you can do a brain scan of them and you can see the cortex lighting up. And you can also see the emotional parts of the brain lighting up. And these are people who are able to strategize to get what they want, to get their emotional needs met, to get the thing they want. And these are where you find your serial killers and these kind of people. And so there are different kinds of psychopaths. So if we take the latter kind of psychopath, really what these are people, they have some kind of emotional need. They have a lot of times they live in a kind of a fantasy world. They have a certain kind of fantasy of just something they want, some fantasy of gratifying an urge or getting something. And that's going to be the motivating force. And the narcissist is really their motivating force. They want to keep that admiration pumped up. They don't want to be an isolated person. Like a lot of like serial killers don't want to get caught. They'll go into isolation. They'll drop off the radar. They don't want to get caught. The BTK killer, you guys may have known about him. He was one of the most horrendous serial killers we had. He didn't get caught for a while. He went off the radar. He would put people in the back of vans and torture them and drive them around. He didn't want to get caught. He was trying to do stuff that people didn't see him, didn't notice what he wasn't trying to be in the public eye. But a narcissist would have a difficult time with that. They'd have a difficult time, dropping off the face of the earth, being silent, living a regular life, pretending to live a regular life. They need to brag about what they're doing. They need to tell people about stuff. They need to exaggerate. They need to get their whatever pumped up, so their basketball grandiose self gets pumped up. And that would be kind of how I'd say it. So, example would be, like just pick a leader. I mean, Putin or somebody like that who's constantly in the media, constantly, people are telling him how great he is. He's doing stuff, and people are pumping him up, telling him how great he is. Not that he doesn't do things on the sly to get things done, but again, the end result is that he's getting pumped up more, right? It's where the serial killer guy is just going to do the stuff on the sly and just get what he wants and doesn't have to talk about it. That makes sense? And again, there's a lot of gray area there, a huge amount of gray area.
That's a really interesting answer. John asks, what are some early warning signs in adolescents or young adults that may indicate a developing narcissist personality pattern?
Yeah, that's a good one. You know, you would probably see, now the easy answer is the malignant narcissist if they're a psychopath, because you can see conduct disorder and things like that. But I would say, the real thing you want to be looking for, probably what I would be interested if I was seeing somebody, and a younger person coming into me, I'd want to see, trying to ascertain if they have a capacity for empathy. I think the capacity for empathy is the most important thing. And that may be something that doesn't show up overtly, especially in young people, because a lot of young people are very self-centered. Just in adolescence, we're all self-centered kind of naturally. But, like, probe a little bit, find out, does this person have a capacity for empathy? I think that's what I would be interested in, especially if they're an adolescent. If they're a kid, that may be harder. But for an adolescent, I'd want to know that, like, as well as, knowing about their upbringing and the other patterns that are going on. Other thing is, if I saw, and this is a little bit technically jargonish, so I'll gloss over it a little bit, but if I'm seeing like an Oedipal situation for the person, they're bringing up an Oedipal conflict, some kind of envy or jealousy kind of thing going on. If I probably want to see if there's how much that is tinged with aggression. If there's a lot of a tinge of aggression in that, that's also going to kind of trigger me to be watching, see what else is going on with this person. Now, they could just be a pathological narcissist and not be a malignant narcissist. Maybe there's not as much aggression, but that's something I keep my third ear, as we call it, out, listening for, maybe a tinge of aggression, and then empathy. I'm very interested in empathy, but I'm not. There's probably psychotherapists in the audience who are much better at answering this question than I am. So I'll just put that out there. So I'm sure there's better answers out there among the group of people listening than what I'm telling you. And people who have more experience with adolescents. I never saw a lot of adolescents, and I didn't, the kids I saw, adolescents I saw, were all really severely autistic or psychotic. I didn't see a lot of narcissistic adolescents or kids. So I'm not the best person maybe to answer that.
All right, well, thank you for your answer anyways. Our next question is, where do you think the practice of incarceration fits into the discussion of narcissism?
Ah, that's a really interesting question. Well, I would say for the narcissist, if the narcissist can't adapt their narcissism to the rules of society, then, like anybody else, they're going to probably end up breaking the law and they'd be incarcerated. The malignant narcissist, if you go to the prisons, and there's lots of studies done on this now, there's a guy who goes around to the prisons and he brings a portable MRI machine and he puts the prisoners in there and he scans their brain. And what does he find? He finds, around 50%, at least 50% people could be diagnosed as psychopathy. Um, if somebody's severely more on the malignant end, they have a lot of psychopathic traits, then there may be levels where people are going to have to be incarcerated, and especially you see this in severely either antisocial personality disorder. There's some narcissism that goes along with that too, but people who like molest children, like child molesters, things like that, probably there's a level of fairly, a lot of most of these guys are going to have to probably, they're not going to be able to adapt to society. They're going to have to probably, especially if the sexual target is something very young, inappropriate, and they have a lot of psychopathic traits, and along with narcissism, they're not going to be very adaptable to society. They're probably going to have to be kept away from children, for instance. And again, at that level, the narcissism and the psychopathy are going to be very difficult to, they may be a little more psychopathic. The narcissist, if they want the admiration, they want to keep that thing pumped up, going to prison's not a great place for that. So, if they can keep it together and not go to prison, then they're going to, whatever's going to keep that grandiose self pumped up more is what they're going to try to be doing. And so I would say probably most cases that means not going to prison. But you never know. But if they can get in a position where they can change the world, where they can make the world adapt to them rather than the other way around, that's what they're going to do, right? If they can go and change the laws so they can be more grandiosity and not be subject to these laws, then that's what they're going to do. If they can do that, they can pull that off. That makes sense?
Yes, thank you.
We run out of questions.
I think I'm next. Sorry. So no, we have a lot of questions. I don't think we can get to them all today, but I think we have time for a few more. Are narcissists introverts or are they typically more extroverted?
That's a very good question. And the psychoanalyst Otto Kernberg has a wonderful diagram. I use this in my class where you can look at all these personality disorders and see which ones are more introverted and extroverted. Narcissists tend to be more extroverted. I would say the tendency is to be more extroverted because again, if you're introverted, you're sitting in your room by yourself, it's harder to pump up your grandiose self. You need other people around, like satellites around, planets around the sun to like, feed into you. So they tend to be more extroverted, I would say. And again, there's always exceptions to things, but I would say that's probably the tendency.
I'm going to put two questions together because I think these two kind of match. One is, considering that narcissism is a spectrum, can the disorder get worse? Like, can one be at level 2 of narcissism and eventually become a level 4? And also, is narcissism a learned behavior or more of an innate personality trait?
So let me take the last part first.
Okay.
There's always learned and innate aspects to everything, right? So, back in the day, the psychoanalysts, everything is psychology, it's all internal, it's all the psychology. But now we know better. We know that there's innate things. We know that there's not only genetic aspects, but there's epigenetic aspects, which parts of the genes are being turned on and off. And that can be related to the environment that the person is in, or even the environment of their parents or grandparents can also affect that. And we know that that's this. There's always innate things, and there's always things that are learned. I get in trouble because a lot of times, when I worked as a psychologist at the state hospital, I was required to function as a behaviorist, applied behavior analyst, and I got in trouble because I would say to people, yeah, I can use applied behavior analysis, in my psychodynamic practice because there's a lot of things that are reinforced that are learned, and vice versa. I can use psychoanalysis stuff in my applied behavior analyst practice in the hospital because there's lots of things I can use to know, for instance, like what the developmental level of a person is will help me find a better reinforcer for a behavior. So I don't see that learn stuff is definitely part of the kind of psychology that we do, that things can be learned. Certainly things are learned in this case. And you can think of, if you want to think about it purely from a behavioral standpoint, you could conceptualize all the things I'm talking about purely behaviorally. The child learns to get attention because that's the only way that they're able to hold themselves together. That reinforces them having a sense of identity, all those kind of things. Those are learned behaviors to some degree. And so I do think things are learned and innate. And then the first part of the question, typically what I think of, so fundamentally, this kind of psychoanalytic, psychodynamic psychology is fundamentally developmental psychology. It all stems out of developmental psychology. And the development starts early on, in infancy and goes into childhood and then, on into adulthood. And then if you follow like, the psychologist Eric Erickson, it can extend throughout life, right? But we tend to think of things going one way. So typically somebody may, if the pathology will stem from a certain level of development. So if the pathology stems from a very early level of development, it's the worse the pathology. So the earlier the level that the pathology stems from, the worse the pathology. If it stems from a higher level, the pathology will be milder. So typically, if you're at a milder level and your pathology comes from that way, typically you don't revert back down to an earlier level. In other words, you think of it like building a house, right? I build the house, I build the foundation first, right? I make the foundation strong. I build the house, I build the first floor on top, I build the second floor. If the foundation is messed up, then the rest of the house is going to be leaning, falling over, it's going to be messed up, right? That's the severe pathology. If the foundation is strong, I build the first floor, but I make a mistake in the first floor and it's kind of leaning, I can fix the first floor, the foundation is fine, right? Breaking something the first floor doesn't affect the foundation of the house, okay? But what you do have happening is that people have the pathology at the foundation level, right? The lower level, the foundation level, but they do something that we call reaching up. In other words, they hum a few bars and fake it that things are stable, and they build the first floor, and the first floor kind of seems stable for a while, but then after a while, the foundation starts to crumble, and then the thing starts leaning over, and they regress back down to an early level of pathology. And that's something actually you can see in more severe pathology. You see it among psychotic people sometimes. And we write about that in our book on schizophrenia. We write about that. And so that's where you might see it regress. But what that meant is that the person, the psychopathology probably was at the foundation level to begin with. It's just the person was able to reach up for a while. Then maybe there was a stressful event or something happened, and then, you know, they regress back down. Hopefully that makes sense without getting too technical about it.
Nope, that's perfect. I think that's going to be our last question for tonight. So sorry if we didn't get to you. Read Kevin's books, and I will toss over to Kelsey to close this out tonight.
So let's have a big round of applause for Professor Volkan. Thank you so much for sharing your fascinating and relevant research with us tonight. I think this has been such an interesting discussion that we've had, and we had so many good questions that people were really engaged with this. If you would like to support his research, consider purchasing his newest book. I believe the link has been put in the chat a few times tonight. Another big round of thanks to the staff of the Alumni Relations and Special Events offices who organized this online forum. Thank you, Shayna, Diana, and Paulina. Our next event for Slugs and Steins will be on Monday, April 14th, and will feature Robert Lund, a UCSC statistics professor, and he'll be covering climate change and extreme weather events related to climate change. And then we always like to mention some upcoming events that you might also be interested in. So this time around, those include this coming Thursday, March 13th, is the 2025 Siddhartha Mitra Memorial Lecture, which will feature Raghuram Rajan. And this event can be attended either in person or virtually, so feel free to sign up for that. And then coming up in April 25th through 27th, is our alumni reunion weekend that celebrates our Golden Slug alumni from the classes of 1965 to 1975. So on behalf of the UCSC Alumni Association, thank you all for joining us. This was such a great turnout. And please come back on April 14th at 6:30 for our next Slugs and Steins event.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Everybody showing up.
Thank you, Kevin.